This is Nina Struthers. You might recognize her from 3 years of big stage E3 talks as Devolver's Chief Synergy Officer, or perhaps from 3 years of Devolver Directs. If you didn't know already, or couldn't tell from the way she ruthlessly murders her co-presenters on stage, Nina isn't real. Nina Struthers was simply a character created to help further Devolver Digital's brand identity as a publisher. That's right. An unhinged, bloodthirsty character was made up to be the public face of an indie game publishing company at the largest gaming events of the year, and she is but one in a sea of fictional narratives spun by Devolver, a now 15-year-old indie publisher, oftentimes attributed as the go-to name when it comes to indie darlings in mainstream hits that seemingly come from nowhere. Nina is at the front of a fictional army, an outlet perhaps for Devolver's avid interest in filmmaking. In fact, in the summer of 2020, Devolver announced their first official mainstream television project for a Devolver-published game in collaboration with DJ2 Entertainment. DJ2 is an entire production company founded to produce video game adaptations, not only responsible for the recent Sonic the Hedgehog films, but also signing for a live-action Sleeping Dogs in film or TV projects for No Man's Sky, It Takes Two, and the narrative masterpiece Disco Elysium. Their project with Devolver, an adaptation of the shoot-'em-up action game My Friend Pedro, of course, set to be written and co-produced by none other than John Wick co-creator Derek Kolstad. Clearly, Devolver's roots are spread wide, with a respect for so many different formats of creative work. TV and film has been a recurring theme. 7 years before announcing My Friend Pedro's TV effort, they had spun off their own Devolver Digital Films arm in the spring of 2013, when Steam was also pursuing online film distribution. They brought along filmmaking veterans like Andy Grace, who shared in the indie spirit and determination of Devolver. As described in the press release, Andy Grace joins Devolver Films as VP of Acquisitions after a 13-year stint on the executive staff of Burning Man, supporting hundreds of film and television projects, production and distribution. You can still use SteamDB to browse the nearly 100 Devolver Digital Films attributed videos released via Steam from 2015 to 2018. Even farther back in 2001, many pre-Devolver creatives formed a video magazine on DVD called SubstanceTV. With the motto, "Show us your substance," it had an evergreen vision to become a platform for gathering, producing, and delivering high-quality video content that transcends the soundbite mentality of mass media to explore the richness and diversity of the world around us. Ultimately, the goal was to support independent ownership and to combine and create media in a colorful variety of formats and offer rich content in 5 areas of exploration: music, film, play, people, and truth. We'll hear a lot about this kind of mission throughout Devolver's history in one way or another. SubstanceTV had originally committed to releasing 10 issues a year, but sadly only saw 7 before closing in 2002. As Devolver founder Mike Wilson reflected, it was maybe a little bit ahead of its time. There's a lot of history with Devolver in their creative endeavors. Nina Struthers and her contemporary stage presenter Fork Parker were created to fill in the gap that gamers expected with a richly satirical kick. The gap of the CEWG and CEWW, or Chief White Guy and Chief White Woman. If you're a fan of video games, you're probably familiar with most companies having a CEWG. You know, the white guy that gets on stage at E3 wearing a blazer and a graphic t-shirt to sell you products. Well, that's where Fork Parker comes from. But why do all this? Why concoct this bizarre mixture of exaggeration and hilarious media manipulation? If you couldn't guess, because that's just Devolver. That's their bread and butter. As they would admit themselves, it's kind of their whole thing. A key aspect to Devolver Digital's identity is, in fact, not having a true face of the company. Devolver Digital has one goal in mind, providing their best-in-class publishing services in the background, giving the real spotlight to the developers behind Devolver's iconic catalog. I hope you're settled in, because today we're exploring Devolver, the myth and the mania. The brands, the games, and the people. The good, and yes, the bad too. Enough intro. Let's get started. Oh, and also don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave your thoughts in a comment below. Unfortunately, I couldn't be around last week due to illness, but I'm back. Full steam ahead. Before Devolver materialized in 2009, its friends and founders championed similar ideologies at similar publishing companies, sometimes working as game developers, media creators, or marketers themselves. In fact, the company's co-founders had twice tried to build a publishing label that offered developers more friendly terms, including ownership over their properties, the most significant of which were named with familiarly spunky, rebellious tendencies, Gathering of Developers Inc., or God Games for short, and Gamecock Media Group. Both of these would become notable, and in some ways notorious in their own right, before both being acquired and inevitably shut down. Gathering of Developers started back in 1998 from future Devolver leaders Mike Wilson, Harry Miller, and Rick Stultz. Wilson and Miller had first met back in the mid-90s when they built Dwango, a multiplayer and matchmaking service for PC games, one of the first of its kind. At that time, it was little more than, quote, entrepreneurial hustling and resourcefulness. We had grown Dwango from 2 guys and a server in Houston to serving most of the country. But quickly the attitude and never settle identity that would become distinctively Devolver reared its head. As they expanded Dwango, they became frustrated with the standards of the industry, even at that time. We had covered just about every major area code. It was all about area code, so you could make a local phone call. About 6 months into that, id Software said, you know, we're gonna start publishing our own stuff, because our publisher sucks, and they're making all the money. Would you like to come do that? Yes, I would. So then I got to go to id Software and be their VP of Marketing and Distribution at age 24. They were kings of the world at that time, and then shortly after, John Carmack made Quake freely playable over the internet, and therefore crushed Dwango forever. I felt really bad for my old friends there. It was like early Hollywood, and you're working with Errol Flynn or something. It was just like kings of the world for a little while, and a great place to start off. That's right, Devolver's dynamic duo had worked at id Software, the makers of Quake and Doom, and Wilson recounts that he was probably the first person to ever leave id Software of his own choice. Next came a short year at Ion Storm, the post-id Software studio of John Romero and Tom Hall, founded after they splintered from id Software due to internal conflicts. Although this was supposed to be a bright, liberating opportunity, Wilson, after all, left at the same time as Romero to be alongside the future developers of Deus Ex, trying to manifest the dream which would become clearer and clearer. Ion Storm wouldn't be the place. I left when John left. You know, John Romero is a very passionate guy, and all the wacky things that I wanted to do at id, he was always behind. That was what I went for, to start our own publishing company. And because the passionate publisher wannabe Wilson refused to let go of the idea of starting our own publisher, he was ousted and forced, for better or worse, to take the plunge and make his own business. Not before, get this, Wilson created and successfully convinced Romero to approve the ad that changed everything. The cringy, unforgettable John Romero's about to make you his bitch print ad for the much delayed, overhyped, invariably commercial flop Daikatana. So, in January 1998, Mike Wilson, along with 4 other founding members, issued a press release officially opening their publishing co-op Gathering of Developers. These founders included the trifecta of Wilson, Miller, and Stoltz, along with faithful business partners Jim Bloom and Doug Myers. The founders owned over half the company, and they started hunting for investors. We're like, but we have a real business with games, and we're going to ship them to stores, and people will buy them. They were like, whatever man, sell me some futures. So it was a rough go. Fortunately, this devil, crook, bastard, genius named Ryan Brandt, who started Take-Two, believed in us. Take-Two at that point was also in its early days, and without their funding, Gathering might not have gotten off the ground at all. But Take-Two's Brandt wrote a check for $5 million to get them started. They had no games and no money. I mean, the $5 million check that Brandt wrote was bigger than their IPO. Gathering was off to a bombastic start. They signed their first game, Jazz Jackrabbit 2, which allowed them to make their first agreement with Epic Mega Games, who would go on to publish 4 more games with them. Between 1998 and 2000, they would sign publishing agreements for PC releases of over a dozen titles, and in 2000 itself, they would almost double that number. For 2000's E3, Gathering set up in a parking lot across the show's main entrance, and barbecue. A strategy we'll come back to in the early days of Devolver over 10 years later. Gathering would arguably be most well known for publishing Stronghold, Rune, and future Devolver revival Serious Sam, as well as their final and virtually most successful game, Max Payne. The latter two are most likely still recognizable to gamers today, and after all, as we know, founder Mike Wilson and Harry Miller had deep experience with the shooter genre. Beyond that, they also brought a port of Mafia to PlayStation 2 with Epic Mega Games and worked with PopTop Software to exclusively publish all of their titles, including the Young Tropico series. They had a long, productive list of one-offs and franchises in a surprisingly short amount of time. Sadly, cherished founder Doug Myers would pass away unexpectedly in May of 2001 of an asthma attack at age 36. As Mike Wilson described, God Games lost its heart and soul, and I lost my best friend in the world for the past 4 years. You can still read through pages of overflowing kindness, memories, and mementos posted by his fellow dreamers, coworkers, and friends at the permanent online memorial. A month later, in June, they would create the Doug Myers Substance Award, with proceeds being donated to the Dallas Children's Advocacy Center in the recipient's name. And after just 2 years in business, Gathering of Developers would be acquired by who else but Take-Two Interactive, their first investor. And by 2004, it would be shut down entirely, after Wilson continued to run the label from inside Take-Two for the almost 2 years that followed. But it was with the estimated $5 million buyout that the team was able to launch the previously mentioned SubstanceTV, which was also the last new business venture from the team of Wilson and Myers. With so many lessons learned, and add to that the untimely death of a close friend and powerful creative ally, Mike Wilson realized that there was no time to waste putting their idea into action. There was still work to be done. By the end of 2006, there was a new label on the horizon, Gamecock, rising like a wingless phoenix to at least ankle height in order to help independent publishers publish their games on PC and console. With its catchy motto, Indie Label Spirit, Major Label Muscle, when asked what the difference was between Gathering and Gamecock, Mike Wilson explained, Philosophically, we are very much the same, practically very different. We are much better funded this time, and not from a competitor. Therefore, our funding comes with a lot less strings. All our funding at Gathering came from a very cash-poor pre-GTA Take-Two. We are also able to publish games for all platforms, whereas our deal with Take-Two before had tied us to the PC platform, which was clearly giving way to the consoles in terms of mass audience. Even in its short lifetime, Gamecock both sparked controversy and laid the groundwork for indie ownership and development. On one hand, as one of their partners, Wideload, and its CEO Alexander Seropian put it, after announcing their party game Hail to the Chimp, "We're working hard to create an original, fun game, and retaining ownership of the IP is a huge benefit. The Gamecock guys have a stellar record in publishing games and treating developers right, and we are poised to give the video game business a much-needed kick in the pants." On top of that same year, Alex believed that now is the best time to be in game development, that it's a more experimental time, a more open time than it's ever been. And Seropian probably knew a thing or two about video game business and pants kicking. After all, he had been a Bungie founder back in '91, and Wideload itself would be acquired by Disney in '09. But on the other hand, Gamecock would continue a different kind of record, one of disruption and anti-establishmentism, as staffers stormed the VGA stage in 2007 in full costume, interrupting Ken Levine's chance to speak at all on his Game of the Year winning BioShock. Even more unbelievable when you realize that BioShock was a Take-Two published game, and yet Take-Two was still offering him a job in New York to return and run their PC vision. Of course, he said no. That was the same infamous year when the winners were presented in the least timeless, least appropriate technique imaginable, body paint. And yes, a day later, Wilson would apologize with regret. But it still happened. So, what became of Gamecock? Well, 2008 came knocking. Simply put, the economy tanked, forcing them once again to find buyers and abandon ship. As later explained by Nigel Lowry, one of the leading partners at Devolver Digital, in a Playboy interview, the economic downturn took away Gamecock because it still had investors backing it. That means Gamecock would only live on its own from 2007 until it had to be bought up by South Peak Interaction in 2008. The announcement broadcast with such disheartening headlines as "South Peak acquires Gamecock Media Group, vocally independent publisher sells to public company," a tone which feels sad but true, and a stark contrast today, where fans have witnessed Devolver go public, reach a near billion-dollar valuation, swap CEOs, and usher in their own mini layoffs. But we'll come back to that, because we're finally caught up. It's time to introduce the star of the show, Devolver Digital. By 2009, Devolver pulled together a new 5-person founding team to rekindle the indie publishing fires. Gamecock's Mike Wilson, Harry Miller, and Rick Stoltz, joined by Chief Marketing Officer Nigel Lowry and Chief Operating Officer Graham Struthers. They started with one of their oldest IP allies, Crow Team, the makers of Serious Sam, a franchise that can trace its roots to the dawn of the modern PC FPS. In the early days of development, Crow Team was inspired by the first-person titans of Doom, Quake, and Duke Nukem 3D. By 2001, the franchise's first title, Serious Sam: The First Encounter, was published by none other than Gathering of developers. After 3 entries, they partnered up with Gamecock to develop a new title using the Serious Engine 3. By 2009, it was a no-brainer for Croteam and the team behind Devolver to join forces again. Despite the lack of money, any real business plan, or a licensed copy of PowerPoint, there was a sense that we would get Devolver airborne. And Croteam, the creators of Serious Sam, who we go way back with, seemed to feel the same. And it worked. Devolver published Serious Sam 3 to critical and commercial success. That springboard resulted in not only that game franchise experiencing a rebirth, but Devolver's vision of being a force for good in the indie community as well. Croteam would go on to be one of the most brilliant studios under Devolver's stewardship, ultimately developing the mind-bending Talos principle, and eventually being acquired by Devolver to become an in-house studio. But it still took several years for Devolver to get settled into a productive release cadence. After all, they were starting from the ground floor, yet again. But with the experience and connections the crew had established for well over a decade at this point, once they took off, they rocketed into success after success. Really, from 2012 onwards, they would be responsible for releasing indie sensations essentially on a yearly basis. The first of its iconic indies would surely be the outrageous Hotline Miami in October of 2012, one of the 5 titles launched that year. In almost every year since, the number of titles premiered from Devolver grew and grew, not just for PC, but for a wide variety of consoles, built in collaboration with studios across the world. We're not going to focus on each and every one of their titles today. After all, it's easy to pull up a timeline of all their classics, from the Talos Principle to Downwell, from Enter the Gungeon to Genital Jousting, from Fall Guys to Loop Hero, from Death's Door to Cult of the Lamb. We'd need a whole nother video to cover the story of each of these. Actually, to do it right, we might need a video for every single one of them. So we're just going to stick to Devolver themselves, and the interesting and little-known facts in between. Like, in the midst of all this, they also tried to build a Kickstarter-like platform, once known as Gambitious, in 2011, before it became a full-featured publisher in 2014, and then rebranded to Good Shepard in 2017, specifically to help talented indies bring their games to market. As Mike Wilson would promise, Good Shepard is borrowing from Devolver's core philosophies as to how we treat and work with artists, but it is also different in that it is being carefully built to be able to scale, whereas Devolver is committed to staying small and laser-focused on what it is arguably the industry's best at. By 2019, Good Shepard would acquire a majority ownership of the studio Artificer, which at the time consisted of over 30 award-winning industry veterans who have previously worked on numerous acclaimed titles, including Call of Juarez and the Dead Island series. And in yet another interesting turn of events, by 2021, Devolver Digital would buy out Good Shepard itself, turning it into a subsidiary. That's right, Devolver is a game publisher who owns its own child game publisher, one that surprisingly has an unabashed focus on investors. Sadly, but perhaps predictably for those familiar with the struggles of being investor-driven, things didn't quite work out so well for Artificer. But we'll touch on that later in the video. Instead, for now, let's get back to talking about Devolver themselves, and let's talk about one of their most public-facing trends: how they did E3. By 2014, Devolver, to no surprise, picked up the mantle of its predecessors and did things differently, intent on making lasting impressions. It was a chance for their classic shock value. It was a stage ripe and ready for performance, with an audience usually foggy and inundated with marketing lingo. For 2014, Devolver didn't even set up their booths in the main hall. They didn't set up anywhere in the LA Convention Center. They set up in the Hooters parking lot across the street, a somewhat familiar line, as you may remember. Gathering of developers similarly set up their promised parking lot across the show's main entrance over a decade ago in 2000. Now, Devolver had a ring of 9 trailers, each with a game in its developer, intentionally light on PR and marketing personalities, as wonderfully detailed in a first-hand account from GameIndustry.biz's Dan Pearson. He spoke with Graham Struthers, who at the time self-described himself as Devolver's code enforcement officer, and explained, "Devolver is 6 people. We don't see it as a brand, or that we have any particular values to be promoted. We're all friends who've worked with each other before. This is our living. It's what we love. There's nothing to sell." I hope that's why the developers like being around us. That what we're interested in is them. Although a lovely sentiment, I have a feeling there was a reason, more important than all the others, as to why developers wanted a seat at Devolver's table. Yes, the acceptance of wild ideas, the freedom to develop in personal ways, the relaxed PR environment, of course that was all important. But in my opinion, what sits on top of the pile was ownership, in control of their own IP, as Struthers himself divulged when speaking about who else but Devolver's prized partner Crow Team. When we were gathering of developers, Crow Team was one of the developers which was part of that. The ethos was kind of the opposite of most other companies of that time, that developers should always retain their own IP, that it was never a deal point. And so when the idea of Devolver was forming, we reached back out to all those developers because we knew they could bring that IP with them, that they'd retained all the rights. Crow Team were keen. We'd obviously not annoyed them much because they let us back in. To me, they're the foundation that the company is based on. I'm very thankful for that. And for Crow Team, the bottom line was we would have shut down our studio in 2008 if it weren't for Devolver. By 2017, Devolver would not only attend E3 officially, but they would radically shift the format for stage performances, with its aforementioned Chief Synergy Officer Nina Struthers laying out an incredulous assortment of anti-buzzwords like screen pay and early access. Right away, Devolver set out to create something different from its contemporaries. Lampooning the traditional format, it presents legitimate game announcements through a satirical lens of a corporate approach to promoting games. In the next year, Nina was back, introducing a mock lootbox cryptocurrency, Lootbox Coin, before being dramatically killed by a Gatling gun in an act of vengeance from the accidental amputation in the previous year's too greedy screen pay system. For the next 5 years, Nina's plotline would continue, from onstage performances to matrix-like direct from the consciousness Devolver Directs to Devolver-only Game of the Year awards. You can find all of these on YouTube and also, appropriately enough, on IMDb under titles like Devolver Digital, Big Fancy Press Conference, Devolver Max Pass Plus Showcase, Monetization as a Service, and Devolver Digital Marketing Countdown to Marketing. I sincerely hope the spirit of these anti-industry short films continues, and we haven't seen the end of Nina yet. But I'm going to stop there before we dive too deep into the rabbit hole of E3 and Devolver's knack for brutal satire. Hopefully this makes a whole lot more sense now that we know that the founders have been pumping away since the very birth of the at-home modern gaming industry of the 90s, and they've truly experienced the trends they've lampooned since day one. Before we get to the present day, let's touch on something special that might be all too easy to forget in today's resurgence of gaming portables and handhelds. The PlayStation Vita. Yes, that's right. Let's talk about Devolver and the Vita. In the earlier days of gathering of developers in Gamecock and even Devolver itself, the intent, whether by choice or not, was mostly for PC releases. Devolver admitted back in 2014, Devolver's natural home isn't on console though, it's on PC. But when the Vita launched, Devolver tried their hand at portable indie gaming with future minority stake owner Sony. Between 2013 and 2016, Devolver published about 10 titles for the much-missed PlayStation Vita. Although the love affair was short, it's still a worthwhile memory to relive. And to be clear, it's not like they needed to work with the Vita, at least according to Graham Struthers. I think it's the other way around, actually. Without the indies, that thing would be gathering dust. He laughs with obvious affection. Devolver's presence on the platform was much appreciated, but not without fault. They introduced many gamers to the dramatic pixelated worlds they had spent years honing on other consoles. But they also overpromised and under-delivered on just as many buggy or unreleased titles. The story begins in 2013, the year after the Vita's launch, when Hotline Miami graced the storefront and rightfully spent 2 months at the top of the EU PSN charts. The next year saw the release of Luftracers, an exciting aerial shoot-'em-up that was sadly encumbered by bugs and a lack of proper developer support both before and after release. It would take until 2015 for Devolver to really hit their stride on the Vita, with the release of Duke Nukem 3D, Hotline Miami 2, Titan Souls, and Hatoful Boyfriend in its sequel Holiday Star. Hotline Miami 2 would have been the 4th best-selling game in the UK on the week of its release, but the rest received mixed reactions from critics, even if they became fan favorites. Sadly, that was all for 2015. Even if it was a great year, it was still disappointing. As this blogger recounts in his insightful post on Devolver's love-hate relationship with the Vita, it was a frustrating turn of events. Devolver had just started showing proper support for the Vita, only to pull the plug on 2 projects, Broforce and Not a Hero, that really shouldn't have been announced before proper technical testing was done. By 2016, the era of Devolver and the Vita was already almost over, with only 2 notable releases, a port of 2013's Foul Play and the much more exciting Downwell, the multi-award-winning soon-to-be mobile classic. Downwell, inspired by the likes of Spelunky and Cave Story, famously got its developer a job at Nintendo in 2018, where he would also famously quit a year later in 2019 to return to indie development. So, the story of Devolver and the Vita is short, spunky, and bittersweet. Although so many more titles were promised in various E3 presentations and beyond, that would already be the end of Devolver and the beloved PlayStation handheld. So you might be thinking, why even cover this in the first place? Well, not only because it's a unique and interesting little blip in the history of both the PSP and Devolver, but also because it helps paint a picture of a company that's not always perfect, who's not immune to the ups and downs of the gaming industry and indie publishing. Being unique doesn't make Devolver untouchable or detached from the gaming industry at large. Perhaps this is a good thing. After all, if we want a hero of the gaming industry, they have to be in the battle with everyone else. Plus, if they were entirely distant from the gaming industry, their fortunes could be dependent on questionable sources or ephemeral funding. Or worse, they could be indebted to ruthless conglomerates like Embracer Group. But either way, it's it's a double-edged sword. So what do I mean when I say Devolver isn't immune? Well, as described by Chris Kerr for GameDeveloper.com, 2024 has been absolutely brutal for game developers, with the huge wave of layoffs that enveloped 2023 continuing to wreak havoc across the industry. And on the last day of January, last month, Devolver drew back its own axe, laying off roughly half of the team at their studio, Artificer, a total of 28 employees. Kotaku has learned that around 25 people, or nearly half of the team at Poland-based game studio Artificer, were laid off on January 31st. Some employees have posted publicly about the layoffs. From its founding in 2019 to its acquisition in 2021 to its 2023 release of its only title to date, Showgunners, the trajectory of Artificer remains uncertain. At practically the same time, the CEO of Devolver for the last 4 years stepped down and was replaced with one of the original founders, Harry Miller. Miller was already an executive chairman and major shareholder and is apparently dedicated to building out a strong pipeline of fun and creativity and of course delivering on our long-term growth strategy. Although that was essentially a financial press release, I would argue that sentence reeks of anything but fun and creativity. In their subsequent financial report, Devolver seemed undeterred by these blemishes, closing out with, again, the frightfully jargony but all too expected, as a result of this momentum for our strategy heading into 2024, we expect normalized, adjusted EBITDA to return to growth in 2024 and accelerate in 2025. EBITDA, of course, being LEET speak for earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization, frequently used as a measure of business profitability. In comparison to other bloodshed across studio veterans, this is perhaps less tragic. But on the other hand, it is more shocking that this would be seen as necessary by Devolver at this stage in its company history. And wasting no time before the dust settled on the CEO change and studio layoffs, Devolver premiered their new game, Children of the Sun. Yes, this was certainly not a split-second decision, but it's still disheartening to see an almost cycle of life and death play out between last month and this month. What may be even less palatable in this context is last year's $40 million acquisition of Astroneer's studio System Era. Usually, the comedic, eccentric tone of Devolver would be a delight. Now it feels bittersweet. 8 long years ago, Devolver made a terrible mistake, it says. They almost published Astroneer. Back when Devolver and System Era were just a glint in the video game industry's eye, both teams vowed to build companies that reflected their spirit of independence. They placed passion and creativity proudly at the forefront of their businesses and quickly found success. Now they have new ambitions that they felt could be explored better together. A few months before that, in April 2023, they acquired Gunbrella developer Doinksoft for an undisclosed amount of money. At that time, it was celebrated. The latest acquisition by Devolver indicates a strong working relationship with their partner studios, having worked closely with Doinksoft already, including on Devolver Bootleg, a selection of D-makes based on the Devolver catalog. And just a few weeks before that, in March 2023, they had launched Terra Nil, the wonderfully meditative twist on the city builder genre, not only on Steam, but also on mobile through partnership with Netflix mobile gaming push. And that wasn't their first foray into mobile partnerships with Netflix itself, with 2022's Netflix exclusive Reigns 3 Kingdom. And before and alongside that, Devolver published Apple Arcade exclusives like Grizz Plus that same year, Reigns Beyond, the entry before 3 Kingdoms in 2022, and quite prominently Exit the Gungeon in 2019, bona fide Apple Arcade launch title. All of this came following 2018's pickup of VP Mark Hickey, who in the early 2000s worked for Gameloft, and after Apple's App Store in 2008 purportedly helped launch over 100 iOS titles. Then, perhaps to no surprise, Hickey would work at Apple from November 2013, helping seal deals with the likes of EA, Activision Blizzard, 2K, Microsoft, and Epic, both familiar names to our story and some of the biggest names in the industry. In 2018, Devolver crowned him VP of Mobile Publishing. Keep all of this in mind as I skip back to 2021 and let loose this next bombshell. In November of that year, Devolver was listed on the London Stock Exchange as the largest valued US company to debut on the AIM submarket, valued at a whopping $950 million. This was also the second largest company ever to trade on AIM. Coinciding with that, they received a flotation of $50 million in gross proceeds, a secondary cash placing of $211 million, and a 5% investment from Sony Interactive Entertainment. And of course, that same year, they bought up 3 other outfits: Indie Studios Nereal of the Reign series, Firefly Studios of the Stronghold series, and Dodge Roll of Enter the Gungeon. On top of that, we already mentioned the late 2020 acquisition of longtime partner Crow Team. Oh, and before we move on, it's worthwhile to note that Sony's involvement with Devolver stretches back all the way to 2014, when Devolver was one of the featured developers in Sony's Indie Rich showcase during its high-powered E3 press conference, heralding a deal which expands the publisher's deal with the platform holder considerably. Perhaps all that work with the Vita was a stepping stone to deeper, more lucrative things from the top down rather than the bottom up. This is all to say that Devolver is a big fish. Their identity is still intrinsically connected to the world of indie, and their history represents something brilliant, but they're not undeserving of scrutiny and at times criticism. They may be a hero to many in the community, even the Sub Pop or Death Row Records of gaming, but they are still a multi-million-dollar business, engaged in a contest to capture a slice of a multi-billion-dollar market cap across the 2 countries they're headquartered in, the US and UK. We can support them for fighting against the endless waves of clones and uninteresting cash grabs, but we can't just give them a free pass to operate without the same scrutiny and attention that we should give to every corporation. Devolver Digital is a remarkable indie game publisher. For a generation, they have been relentlessly dedicated to upsetting the status quo. When the AAAs demand live services and battle royales, Devolver funds wacky 2D single-player action games and nearly unmonetizable couch multiplayer party games. More than that, it has the ability to turn them into cultural phenomenons and sign the rights to adapt them into TV shows. When we expect heartless executives, Devolver all but rips the heart out of fictional, stereotypical executives on stage. Even with an uncertain future, they remain a shockingly small operation. Starting from just 5 or 6 founders, it's hard to imagine them going anywhere anytime soon. The founders have been forging a path for most of their lifetimes, with track records that are unparalleled in the indie game world. And especially with the context that much of what they built before is gone now, had to be sold, some just a year or 2 after being in business, I think it's clear that Devolver is the long-term vision. So, I hope you join me in rapt anticipation for what comes next from these wranglers of insanity, these proffers of the unusual, these undertakers of bespoke counterculture marvels. And I hope you join me next week, as we're right back on track for more ideas from yours truly. If you liked this mini-doc, make sure to check out my video from a few weeks ago on teenage engineering. And if you're a fellow aficionado of super nerdy things, I'd love it if you could check out my last video on La Colombe's draft latte in a can. But that's it for me. Thanks for coming by.